Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a fine crowd, and that's very pleasing. For those of you I don't know, I'm Judd King, Director of the Center for Studies in Higher Education, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here. I will begin by saying a few words about Clark Kerr and the Clark Kerr Lectures, and then I will pass it to our Chancellor, who will tell you about this year's Clark Kerr Lecture. So, Clark Kerr was the first chancellor of the Berkeley campus and then president of the University of California during a decade that was both formative and turbulent. He was born in Pennsylvania in 1911, was educated at Swarthmore and Stanford before coming to the University of California, where he achieved his PhD in economics in 1939. He returned as Associate Professor of Industrial Relations in the School of Business Administration and as the founding director of the Institute of Industrial Relations. He achieved fame as a skilled negotiator between labor and management, dealing with such as Harry Bridges. Building upon his background, he helped greatly in the negotiations and resolutions of the California loyalty oath controversy. He also needed and used all those skills as he became the first of the campus chancellors in 1952. Fired with enthusiasm, a term which he later used in another context, he became president of the university in 1958. As president, he devised and oversaw the process by which many aspects of the administration were devolved to the chancellors of the campuses, leading to the strong University of California campuses and system that we have today. And we do retain strength despite the budget nipping at us. He created the essentials of the system of governance within UC that still persists. He oversaw the launching, development, and most important of all, the definition of the 3 new campuses in Irvine, San Diego, and Santa Cruz that have become major success stories of the past 4 decades or more. And not by his choosing, he became the first of many presidents of major universities to have to deal in a very public way with the great complexities and challenges brought to campuses in association with the social unrest movements of the 1960s. His experiences as president are well and engagingly chronicled in his 2-volume book, UC Press, The Gold and the Blue. Upon leaving the presidency of UC, Clark Kerr became chair and director of the Carnegie Commission on the Future of Higher Education, and then the Carnegie Council on Policy Studies. And this took the period 1967 to 1979 and led to a remarkable series of books that still provide good guidance today. There are, I believe, over 50 books in that series that he stimulated and oversaw. In 1963, Kerr gave a series of lectures at Harvard known as the Godkin Lectures. In these lectures, he presented concepts of research universities and coined the term multiversity to describe all the things we now do. Those lectures live on in a book entitled The Uses of the University, which went through 5 editions. The Clark Kerr Lectures are modeled after these Godkin Lectures. The subject overall is the role of higher education in society. The lectures are generously supported both by the University of California and by the Carnegie Corporation, a combination that reflects and symbolizes Clark Kerr's vital contributions to the world of higher education. And with that, I will turn the podium over to Chancellor Bergeneau, who will introduce our lecturer.
So thank you, Judd. It's almost embarrassing to come up here to introduce Neil because almost everybody in the audience knows everything I'm about to say and more. But just in case there's 1 or 2 people who don't know all the details of his extraordinary career, I'll go through it, but hopefully fairly quickly. So it's obviously a great honor to introduce Professor Neil Smeltzer, who's our Clark Kerr lecturer this year. And he's following not only in the tradition of the great Clark Kerr himself, who, by the way, if you happen to be chancellor, it's very humbling to read the two blue and gold books. but also a series of wonderful lectures that have been given in this series, and I know that Neil will hold up the high standards. He's a professor emeritus of sociology here at UC Berkeley, and also a university professor emeritus, which is an honor reserved for a very, very small number of faculty members of UC as a whole. And he's had a long and distinguished career, is continuing to have a long and distinguished career as a leader in higher education. We just don't pay him anymore, but still. And he's recognized as a profound observer of higher education in America. He's the author of 18 books, former president of the American Sociological Association, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and a member of the American Philosophical Society, one of, I think, 30 Berkeley faculty members who have received that most distinguished honor. He joined UC Berkeley as a faculty member in 1958, just after receiving his PhD from Harvard. He remained at Berkeley for 36 years, and then I think took a VERUP. Is that right? Right. So retired. And I needed to say that because he then moved to Stanford. I didn't want this to be interpreted as some kind of disloyalty. And he spent several years at Stanford directing the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, and then returned here to Cal in 2001, where he's continued his research and writing. His most recent book, published in 2010, is a collection of essays entitled Reflections on the University of California, from the free speech movement to the global university. In the introduction, he outlines his many involvements that have touched on nearly all aspects of the campus. As Neil himself writes, and I'll quote, in my eventful years at the University of California, I had occasion to touch many parts of that special elephant, thereby gaining perspectives and knowledge from different points of view. His many roles included actually a sort of parallel career as a practicing therapist at the old Cowell Hospital, 2 terms as chair of the Department of Sociology, affiliation with the Institute of Industrial Relations, associate director of the Institute of International Studies, acting director of the Center for Studies in Higher Education, which Judd knows all about, and director of the UC Education Abroad program for the United Kingdom and Ireland. He served in the Academic Senate, where he was chair of both the Berkeley Division and of the System-wide Academic Council and Assembly. His service also extended to the Chancellor's Office, where he was assistant to the Chancellor for student political activity. I didn't know there was political activity at Berkeley. No one told me before. And for educational development in the turbulent 1960s, and informal advisor on subsequent occasions. He also served as special advisor on long-term planning to President Jack Peltison in the 1990s. He worked as critic and advisor to both Clark Kerr and David Gardner, past presidents of the university, as they prepared their respective memoirs. He was a faculty representative to the Board of Regents and also a member of the laboratory advisory committees appointed by the Office of the President. As Neil says modestly, out of these involvements emerged a great deal of knowledge and writing about the university. I might add, actually, when I first arrived here to Berkeley as chancellor, one of the things that I particularly appreciated is I was made aware of and given several Smelser reports and essays that I still often refer to, including, it happens last year, or a year and a half ago, I guess now, his report on intercollegiate athletics, which was prescient, I must say. He also has an essay on how to predict and deal with surprises affecting the Berkeley campus. As if that's possible. I'm about to reread, actually I scanned it already, but I'll read it more carefully, his advisory memo on governing the university written in 1994, which contains broad reflections on looming problems that would confront the University of California in the next 2 decades. And the whole issue of governance is an extraordinarily interesting one. On May 5th, 2001, a celebration of Clark Kerr's 90th birthday took place at University House. And Neil was one of the speakers that evening. He spoke of Clark Kerr's exceptional analytic powers, his reach and scope, and his insight, and Neil said, If he writes that there are 6 factors at work in shaping some important historical trend in higher education, you may be assured that there are truly 6, not 5 and not 7. The same might be said of Neil's analytic powers and insights. For his lifelong study of what he calls the macroscopic social structural level of social life, including the role of higher education in society, Neil J. Smelser is a most worthy recipient of the honor that has been bestowed upon him to be chosen to deliver the 2012 Clark Kerr Lectures. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Smelser. And the title of his talk is Dynamics of American Universities.
Thank you so much, Chancellor Bergenau. I'm truly honored, and I would like to take this occasion to honor the figure for whom the lectures are named and to acknowledge how deeply honored I am to be one of the lecturers chosen to give them. I do both of these things not out of pressure of ceremony, but from the heart. And I would like to begin by a few remarks about Clark Kerr, but more of a personal nature. I met him in 1958, 2 weeks after I arrived in Berkeley as a beginning assistant professor. They gave a party, Clark Kerr and Glenn Seaborg, for all new appointees, and we went. We merely shook hands at the time, and I was a face in the crowd, but I knew about his role in the loyalty oath already. But I could not have known about the fantastic history of the following decade, the master plan, his presidency, his riding over the multiple crises of the 60s and establishing his, himself as the century's leading spokesman for higher education, all within a 10-year period. In the following decade, I myself was drawn into campus affairs, as Chancellor Bergenau noted, and Clark Kerr came to notice me. He invited me to join the technical advisory committee of his Carnegie Commission that was forming in the early 60s. There I, along with Martin Troe and Sheldon Rothblatt and Bud Chait and Fred Balderston, we came to form a group. I call this group Clark's Boys, because we listened carefully to everything he said and did everything he wanted us to do by way of advising him. My relationship with Clark was cemented in those years, and he sought my advice on diverse matters and ultimately my help with his memoirs. Clark Kerr and I would meet in the Clark Kerr room of the men's faculty club, and I would always order the Clark Kerr special from the menu, even when I didn't like it. I was very humbled when Clark invited me to write the foreword to The Gold and the Blue from a crowd of much more visible, much more notable candidates. Well, I apologize for this too personal introduction, but I felt it important to reveal the depth of my own memories and feelings about this remarkable man. Now, a few explanatory and orienting points. I know that from reading in the past months in the literature on higher education and the press, that there is an atmosphere of dark gloom that pervades the current headlines about American higher education. Budgetary starvation, commercialization, distance education, for-profits, proletarianization of the academic labor force by the non-tenure track, on and on and on. And I dare say these are mainly questions in your minds as well. I will comment on these, but not right away, and not in the language and passion of the day, and only after context is laid. This should not inhibit you from asking harsh and open questions at any time, however, which I am, by this time, an absolute expert at dodging. I regard these three lectures as a single lecture, actually, or if I may be a little presumptuous, a kind of symphony with three movements. Today, I lay out a simple theory of social change about how the university has changed over the century. And toward the end, I will trace some ramifications of this rather simple theory of change that I'm going to put out, and dedicate the second lecture to all further ramifications of it. Then in the third, I'll turn to some of these contemporary problems that I just gave reference to and give my own comments in the context of what I hope I've established as some historical and institutional background. So I will say finally, by way of orientation, that my approach will be that of a sociologist. In many respects, I'm going to be revitalizing the notion of a social system which has fallen out of some favor in the social sciences, but certainly absolutely essential in understanding not only a campus, but also systems of education and higher education as a whole. And I will be using the standard sociological repertoire of social structure and culture, groups, group conflict. Nothing revolutionary about this, but I've found that the use of this framework has allowed me to put some things together that are not usually associated with one another in thinking about higher education. So much by way of orientation. I first asked, what kind of creature is higher education? And I believe that many of you, if not all of you, know that that question is often addressed initially by looking at its functions. And that list of functions is familiar. Provide socialization to the older young, to create and transmit knowledge, to be of service to society, to foster achievement, social mobility, social justice, to impart democratic values, to preserve and hone and augment and criticize cultural and culturally valued principles. These are all very familiar. They're repeated a lot in commencement addresses and elsewhere. We all know them. But in thinking about them, I've come to regard them as somewhat problematical, and in the following ways. First of all, what is their conceptual status? Do they describe what institutions accomplish or what they strive to accomplish? Are they rather claims to cultural legitimacy more than actual functions? Are they a form of institutional advocacy, claims to status, ploys for seeking support, or defenses to be used when institutions are under attack? They're all of these things, of course. And this unclarity makes for ambiguity of what these functions really are. Their causal status is ambiguous. They assert that the university does certain activities and then there are certain effects in society. It's seldom really verified and very hard to verify, as our research on the results of schooling and educational impact show. And because of these ambiguities, these functional claims ask for a certain generalized faith that we are doing these things, and this faith is not automatically guaranteed. Now, because of these ambiguities, I tend to treat these functions as compacts between agencies in society and the university. Societal agencies such as donors and foundations and governments find things about the university that they consider valuable, and they're willing to supply resources to the university for doing them. Or, if educational institutions are opportunistic and proactive, they seek out new functions and try to find ways to have them supported. So these functions are not legal contracts for delivery, for a consideration, but these mutual expectations on the part of donor and donee as to what the institution is all about. All this means that we live in a large world of ambiguity as to what's expected of us and what we do. This is a tremendous advantage because Outsiders usually grant freedom and autonomy in carrying out these functions. However, because of this vagueness, we also increase the probabilities of misunderstandings, disappointments, conflicts, accusations of promises made but not kept. These consequences seem to be in the nature of the case, and they make sense of a lot of things I'm going to talk about later with respect to conflict. Final key characteristic of higher education is its moral embeddedness. Because we are largely a secular institution, we sometimes forget this, but it's absolutely certain. There are two bases for this. Of course, functional, or any institution involved in the socialization of the young is a moral institution, family, church, educational systems. The other is historical, that is to say, the modern university is rooted in the moral religious traditions which have not died despite the de-churching of higher education. And these include a certain ascetic, anti-materialistic idea, a certain idea of a calling, and a sort of expectation we're not to be too involved in the worldly rewards. These are expectations held outside the academy and within it. They've become much more implicit and much more subdued in modern times. Now, the three corollaries follow from being in a moral status. One is high expectations are generated. Being an academic is a special role, and I argue academics still constitute a quasi-priestly group in society. Academics, being moral guardians, are granted high status, though this descends by type of institution, and they do not hesitate to grant others less status. Academic contempt is alive and well. James Duderstadt, a longtime administrator, no doubt battle-scarred, said simply, "Academic arrogance knows no bounds." Finally, deviation from moral and special and high-status expectations is more than simply straying. It carries a special idea of some corruption of the sacred and justifies strong moral reactions. The name of the game in academia, and I hope this principle of continuing moral preoccupation will also edify some of the things that I'm going to be saying. A continuing and dominating theme of what's going to characterize these lectures is the idea of growth. It's the hallmark of the history of American higher education. It has to be front and center of anything we think about in our thinking about higher education. And first, I'd like to do a little bit of theoretical ground clearing and talk about what growth involves. Of course, we think of growth, we think of increase in numbers more or less automatically, and that's obviously what happens, but numbers cannot simply increase without sooner or later involving a number of different types of structural change, and I'd just like to tick those off by way of introducing my main point of this lecture. You can increase or grow a system by just simply increasing the size of units. I mean, increasing the size of families is often behind population change. We can increase the size of our own educational systems by admitting students and more faculty. You can also segment like units. Another source of population growth is simply the growth of more and more families without altering this basic structure of the families themselves. Similarly, you can add new community colleges, you can add new campuses and so on, and that's another way of accommodating greater numbers. But then we get into more complicated forms of change, and I would like to first mention the differentiation or division of labor or specialization of units as a way of growing or accommodating growth. You simply create different kinds of units rather than having the same system grow or grow in size. And of course, This is the hallmark of social change in the Western world and ongoing change in the whole world of differentiating different types of institutions in all corners of the society. Another way of accommodating growth is to proliferate functions, to add to existing structures. So you can add departments, you can add agencies to governments, bureaucracies, and so on. But with respect to all these different types of growth and structural alterations, you generally begin to create new problems of coordination. I mean, my ancestor, Emil Durkheim, was the one who pointed out is if your society begins to grow in complexity, you simply have to have more complex arrangements in order to manage the complexity. And that is one of the principles of social change for which sociologists gain much of their salary in pointing out repeatedly as to what happens in periods of rapid social change. Now, I would like to identify a special form of social change that has characterized higher education in its history in this country, especially universities. I call this structural accretion. I used to call it blistering, but I got scalded because blistering seems to have too negative a connotation, so I call it neutrally structural accretion. Here's how I define it. Structural accretion is the incorporation of new functions over time without, however, shedding existing ones or splitting into separate organizations. Just accumulate is the name of the game. This applies, I say, to universities, and it's implicit in Kerr's famous characterization of the multiversity, very much continuous with that analysis. Now, what are the driving mechanisms of this? First of all, we have a culture of growth. Rosenzweig said the institutional impulse is not to restrain growth, but to support it. Standing still is contrary to the nature of the beast, and contraction is simply an abomination. So we have a kind of cultural expectation of growth, very American. And this force of mutual opportunism, this play between external opportunity and the opportunity of universities to do their thing, is, of course, lends itself to the accretion of new functions at all times. Competition among and emulation of institutions of higher education. Vern Statman said the tendency for institutions to emulate the most prestigious, largest, and most secure colleges and universities. A very important principle. I'll return to it many times. So much for the growth impulse. How about the failure to shrink impulse? Well, we turn first to organizational inertia, which is everywhere, of course, but very strong in academic institutions. Conservatism of the faculty is legendary. You probably have heard the riddle, what is more difficult to change than the course of history? And the answer is a history course. Or perhaps you've also heard of the riddle, how many Oxford Dons does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is change. And of course, faculty committees are legendary for the multiple strategies that they have for diverting and blocking change. Well, I would like to run down very quickly what I see as some of the main instances of accretion over time in our system that has led to what we are now. I mean, in the 19th century, up to about the middle, higher education was pretty much a 4-year undergraduate affair, right? In the late 19th century, we added postgraduate degrees, beginning with Yale's in 1860. including doctoral degrees, without shedding the baccalaureate. We just piled it on top of the baccalaureate. Late 19th century also added law and medical professional schools and many, many more professional schools later within the university, not shedding the other elements. The late 19th century came the research emphasis, the proliferation of discipline-based departments. This research impulse was accelerated throughout the 20th century with foundations and government and industry producing the organized research unit, but not shedding the traditional elements of education. Then we developed summer schools, correspondence courses, extension programs, now distance learning, of which I will talk later. Collegiate programs within the college. Monteith at Michigan, we had our Muscatine program and our Tussman program here. Public entertainment and enlightenment, museums, public lectures, drama, intercollegiate athletics, intramural physical education, all leading to units on somehow or other connected with the campus and carried out in the name of the campus. We added university presses. We had administrative adjuncts of advising and consulting and offices for institutional research. We have responses to social movements, creating courses of ethnic studies and women's and gay studies. New environmental studies are in certain respects a response to outside concerns. They all just build on, and we just add them. And so we have this unbelievably complex accretion of different types of units, which have increasingly little in common with one another. They just add on to the system. Now, this is in addition, I might say finally that we add accretions to make more accretions. Fundraising, development offices, campaign committees, alumni relations offices, sponsored research, technology transfer, units to bring in new units in our system. And they develop their own autonomy, and they get stacked on top of everything else. Furthermore, these accretions seem to grow whether the system is growing or not. That is to say, it makes sense to see the university building up these new functions when there are opportunities and money and so on in the environment. They take advantage of them. They compete with one another for those advantages. However, when things go a little bit flat or downward, you have to figure out ways to make the best of the money you have, so you create new offices for that. And even in bad times, you see administrative functions increasing faster than faculty and student numbers. I'll say more about that too. Well, to go back now to the mechanisms for inertia, I had my jokes about the faculty, but there are more, you might say, pervasive or systemic qualities that also are sources of organizational inertia. First, universities often live in the absence of market mechanisms that automatically shut them down, the way you might find in business. The mechanisms for sustaining colleges and universities are mostly political and administrative, and decisions to cut them back or to get rid of them are political, and they involve political mechanisms rather than these automatic workings of the market. And legislatures are very reluctant to get rid of particularly their flagship institutions, but also anything that has been created. The burden of proof is on special political reasons for not having them. I will mention only in passing the institution of tenure, which is a source of great rigidity in institutions of higher education, because particularly if faculty are involved in given units, then you are flirting with sort of fundamental principles of tenure, and that also itself is a mechanism for not changing, not shrinking. But there's another more fundamental, what I call social science axiom I would like to summarize for you that works, that is at work. The logic is as follows. If you create a new function, or take on a new function, you have to create a new structure to carry it out. An organized research unit, administrative division, an office. If you create a structure, you also create a group of people who inhabit that structure. And if you create a group, you create a constituency, one which typically includes as one of its primary interests its own survival and advancement in the institution. By this logic, the process of proliferation adds new constituencies, and much of my second lecture will be dedicated to the consequence of this fundamental fact. These press their interests through strategies of argument, influence, and stonewalling, mainly in budget preparing and budget renewing seasons. And it's finally a part of this axiomatic system that for reasons of political survival, universities and colleges do not go much in for the killing of units, but they shave around the edges. As it has been put, or as I have put it, in hard times, you stop cutting the grass, but you don't cut the faculty. You eliminate support staff, you defer maintenance, you cut libraries' acquisitions. You don't cut units, and you protect the faculty, and you don't close institutions. I was a member of an advisory committee to Yale in the late 1980s when they decided that it would be most rational to eliminate 5 departments that were not very strong in the first place. I saw a serious, I got involved in it because one of those was the social science department, and I witnessed a gradual transformation from this administrative attempt into a major faculty report and the disappearance of 3 top administrators rather than any departments at all. There's some talk about unbundling, but here we refer mainly to cafeteria services, health services, parking, not educationally central functions. Okay, that's this little simple theory that I have tried to push as far as I can to account for what really has happened historically and continues to go on, of course. And I will pause at this moment to say a few words about 2 of the quintessential accretions, the academic department and the organized research unit. I'll be very brief. I want to leave quite a bit of time for questioning at the end. The academic department has been described by Alain Touraine, the French social scientist, as the great American invention. It was, in a sense, a copy of some of the European faculties, but it was much more democratic in structure and much more collegial in nature. But it has become enormously powerful in the following ways. It determines the curriculum. It trains people in disciplines. It names the specialists it's trained by their own names. It is reflected in national associations of disciplinary nature. It's a labor market, a source of a labor market, because you hire people according to their department and discipline, not according to being a social scientist or a humanist or something, but more, and they get onto publishers' lists. Publishers have a political science list named after departments and disciplines and courses. They fundraising and honorary societies classify their own giving by departments or division. They are the divisions of the National Honorary Societies, the National Academy of Sciences. It organizes itself by discipline. And they're very hard to kill. They can be squeezed, but seldom strangled. They also are a force for budgetary negotiation. I'm sure anyone who's been in academic administration have heard endless cries of department chairs that we have to cover the field. And if we leave out Iberian history, the entire field of history is going to, go down the tube. This is a source of expansion. And arguments that continuously are made in all departments, threatening the worst and and gaining footholds by this particular kind of argument. Those that happen to be combined into many departments into one don't like it as a rule because they think they're being cheated by numbers that the combination involves. My own department where I received my training, the Social Relations Department at Harvard, had 3 disciplines in it. And over a period of years, they all became restive. They thought they were being held back in size because there were 3 in 1. And ultimately, after 15 years of that experiment, they broke up into conventional departments. Another feature of the departments is how powerful they are despite the fact that they're very low on authority. And the department chair is a very low on authority. He's an expert in persuasion and coddling and diplomacy and coordination, and conflict management. I once made up a definition after I was chair. A department chair is a person that spends 80% of his time running errands for disagreeable colleagues. I think it's still sort of about right. The Organized Research Unit is a separate growth, as I indicated, and it's separate from the academic department as a rule. It's often financed from outside, doesn't give courses as a rule, doesn't give academic appointments as a rule, though it buys people's times off. And it's they've accumulated on major campuses, so they're up in the scores by now on a major campuses, and they continue growing as opportunities arise for research directions. They are in many respects competitors for departments. They take people away. They are often richer than departments. They often have more loyalty on the part of their specialized researchers than departments have, which are much more heterogeneous in their academic interests. And they're also very hard to kill. I once described an academic, and if they take a lot of power away, of community away from the department, I once described the academic department as a kind of emptying residual. Place where the chair negotiates over what and how much faculty teach, and an arena in which colleagues fight over who gets hired and who does not. It might be said that departments have been hollowed out as intellectual communities, but retain vitality as political unities, which is a somewhat of a contradiction. Now, 2 other items I'd like to cover before opening for questions. One has to do with a form of endemic conflict that I have seemed to have identified as being associated with this growth and blistering process. That's the following. Growth is not a matter simply of creative destruction, of creating something new and destroying the old. We have a principle of accretion superimposes new arrangements on old ones. And it seems inevitable from this double aspect that circumstantial change is greeted with ambivalence, both welcomed and resented. In addition, the human mind is sufficiently agile, or unruly, if you will, that one consequence of circumstantial change is that those affected by it select one side of this double aspect of welcoming or rejecting, generalize and extrapolate from it, and create runaway predictions that result in predictions of positive utopias, Pangloss, or negative ones, Cassandra. Give you a few examples. In 1913, Thomas Edison said, "Our school system will be completely changed in the next 10 years by the advent of film." When radio came along, the end of sports attendance was predicted, and television created the same predictions. Television also was to lead to the end of movies. So you get this kind of all or nothing reaction split of assessment. And I submit that in the history of higher education really reflects this tendency consistently during periods of change. You get a dismissal of an archaic past and a glorification of a brave new world by the writers of change. You get a glorification of a treasured past and a dread of ruination by those who oppose it. So you got 4 utopias, 2 in the future, 2 in the past, 2 positive, 2 negative, accompanying these circumstantial changes. And I will only list, because of the time passing, I will only list historical examples of this. Of course, when the college was in decline and the university was in ascent, there was an enormous romanticization of the college, and it still exists. The 4-year liberal arts college is still a source of great romantic affection to something of the past and something superior to the mass institutions we now have. Continuous assault on vocationalism as business schools and professional schools came along, still with us. There was even ambivalence toward the GI Bill when it was passed, which is largely thought to be unobjectionable by some college presidents who thought it was going to destroy the atmosphere, the bucolic, the traditional atmosphere of their colleges. We had serious opposition to foundation support in the 1930s on the grounds that business was interfering with the aims of universities. And we had serious opposition to the movement on the part of the federal government in the post-World War II period as ruining the university's traditional missions. We now have glorification and dread of the computer and online education, which fills the literature. One negative quote only: "The new technology of education robs faculty of their knowledge and skills, their control over their working life, and ultimately their means of livelihood." This is very extreme stuff, but it seems to be a kind of it's embedded in the moral embeddedness of universities, and it's also a powerful rhetorical device to say we are in crisis or we are on the edge of some kind of utopian change. As a matter of fact, the word crisis is so overused in our system that we've now more or less given it up, and we use the phrase real crisis, which suggests the bankruptcy of the term crisis in our environment. Now, finally, 2 ramifications of this accretion process to begin that line of analysis. The faculty activities have become more differentiated, more diversified, and dispersed. They just do more of different things. The demands of running the institution become greater and greater as the institution becomes larger and more complex. Teaching, research, committees, writing for research grants, consulting, conferences, strategy, travel. Jacques Barzun, 50 years ago, talked about the academic in orbit. And we used to have a joke that we were adhering to the Strategic Air Command policy of 1 professor in the air at all times. So this differentiation they also have the differentiation of faculty activities. That is to say, the faculty gives up some of activities as well as such as personal therapy with students. They accumulate teaching and lab assistants to do some of the work that they're doing. Faculty research personnel, non-faculty research personnel, these expand very rapidly as the research function of the university begins to go ahead. And I also tracked the different kinds of personnel and their growth in the 1950s and 60s, and just saw the temporary personnel, the research assistants, the teaching assistants, non-faculty just outrunning all categories of faculty altogether as they were being forced to, not being forced, but willingly giving up some of the teaching to others. These were also, I'll have to add, second-class citizens that were accumulating on the faculty who did not participate in the full control or membership of the faculty, but tended to be on the margins without a great deal of power and responsibility. Secondly, the blistering leads to a clear and indelible change in faculty community. The sheer size of faculties in major universities tells the whole story. I mean, the University of California at Berkeley has had up close to 2,000 faculty members. What can you do, even in a lifetime of meeting more than a tiny fraction of these people, much less developing some kind of communal relations with them? You also get increasing fragmentation and specialization. You get siloization among units and within units. And you get these addition of many ancillary, especially non-academic activities with their own agendas, their own interests, and their own seeking of company with one another. I'd like to, as my last comment, conclude by saying that what university community remains is what Clark Kerr called a whole series of communities, and perhaps a residual general community that is largely imagined or supposed. It is proclaimed on ceremonial occasions by campus leaders and by governing boards, at athletic events, and in times of real political crisis. This is an odd thing because I personally feel myself a member of a community here at Berkeley, and I love it, and it's very meaningful to me to be at the institution. But I also do not, I think, delude myself into thinking that that community really exists. Thank you very much.
As Neil has already hinted to us, he will be willing to take some questions, and we can go on, and I'm going to let him be the one to moderate this. I will stand up when we must end.
I think there are microphones will be going up and down the aisles. So, anybody? Yes?
What 5 functions at the University of California, Berkeley would you lop off? 5 departments or 5 elements?
5 is not enough.
Let's go 10.
I'll say something a little more serious than that. One reason that I did, in the end, choose the idea of structural accretion is that I did want to communicate, if not a neutral, then a double attitude toward that. That we tend to think of these accretions as administrative tools. Right? I don't know. I cannot tell the difference between reasonable growth and bloat myself. Very hard to establish which is which. But I do have the feeling that the move toward outsourcing activities that have to be coordinated by the central academic authority is probably a good trend. I mean, may or may not be economical, you can't tell. Outside, you come into new forces, you don't, as a cost controlling. But I would also add, and this is not an answer to your question, but also add it's politically very difficult to outsource these academic functions. I mean, the talk of letting foreign languages be taught by, in the first 2 years, for example, outside the campus and so on, it happens from time to time. Educational functions are outsourced, but in great resistance and a great sense of we've had movements around the country to cut off the lower division, as universities have, but these have been absolutely killed, both by faculty and by coaches who cannot field, football teams without a 4-year, and by professors and graduate students as a source of great employment for teaching assistants. So, more inertia. Sorry to say. Yes?
How do you compare the American university with the American corporation?
Compare it. In some respects, the American corporation, the American university, will give you a similar sort of different internal differentiation. Corporations will divide themselves geographically into the areas they serve, for example, and create new divisions. That way, they They will have human relations departments. They will have research and development departments. They will differentiate. And sometimes, as if they merge, they will involve accretions as well, not all of which are very easy to accommodate. And they have a very mixed story in my own reading of the merger movement in this country. But by and large, they have both motive and mechanisms for limiting it that are stronger than they are in academic institutions. Their motives are cost. They're forever interested in reducing costs as one of the means of maintaining their position in the market. So they're much more highly motivated to do so. And they operate much more by executive authority than any academic institution ever operates. So these would be two of the main differences I would identify. Yes, George.
I wonder if you could reflect upon a tendency for departmentalization to create homogenization within the departmental units.
Yes, I could. I think that it does not create homogenization. And this is my thinking, that in the dynamics of the growth of an academic discipline, the ultimate and forever story is fragmentation, specialization, and diversification, and less capacity to talk to one another in those things one feels passionate about, much less to collaborate across the distancing lines. So that from a point of view of the discipline and the culture of the faculty members, that is the tendency. But to keep these all within one unit, that's the irony. They don't split very often. The structural constancy of units is remarkable. I mean, you do get changes mostly in the sciences, and remarkably in some of the biological sciences. But if you look at the list of, say, social science and humanities departments, they're about 100 years old, and they haven't changed at all. They've got their same names. They've just become more and more complex and more internally diversified, less homogeneous, and less really capable of collective action, because these divisions and specializations also create vested interests within departments, which faculty members stand on and fight for and want to have the next appointment made in, so that this was kind of behind my very brief remarks about I call it a contradiction between disciplinary culture and the social structure of departments. The one being the last being extremely stable, the other being extremely dynamic, as it should be. Yes?
Have you thought at all about how globalization is impacting your notion of accretion? Did you hear that?
Yes,
yeah.
I've got it.
Yeah, but also its impact on the integrity and community, because you were suggesting that accretion affects community. Will foreign sources of money, foreign relations, and globalization, how will they impact integrity and community?
I will answer that question, but I will refuse to define what is meant by globalization, which I cannot be done. It certainly would include education abroad programs, which was one of my list of accretions I don't think I mentioned. It would certainly include an increased activity in international associations on the part of professionals, which has been on the increase in almost all fields, international communication. It would also include collaborative arrangements between institutions, sometimes even setting up campuses in other societies, in other countries, so on and so forth. Those would be examples of globalization, I suppose. Well, a lot of them involve accretions. You have new programs, you've got new units, new things to administer, new vested interest groups on campuses. So in that respect, globalization has brought a kind of increase, as you say, or an acceleration of the complexity of institutions without the fact they are still located in a community and still do all the things they used to do. So I guess the most important consequence, I would say, of globalization would be more of the same and simultaneously less integration of a campus or university system. Yes?
At the beginning of your remarks, you talked about Clark Kerr's efforts to devolve authority from the center to the campus, from the central administration to the campuses. And in the history of UC, at least, we seem to go back and forth between periods of decentralization and then accretion seems to happen again, and the center gets more control. Right now, we're in obviously a devolutionary period, but it seems to run counter to accretion, at least the devolution that occurred under Kerr. And could you comment on that?
Yes, it's in a way, I wouldn't say it's a contradiction, it's just a different angle of what's happening to governance and coordination. I would issue a personal invitation to you to come to the second lecture, in which I'm going to talk about different facets of the multi-campus phenomenon. This may be on this campus the hottest item of the whole series, and I will talk on the. Well, I don't want to give that part of my lecture right now, but I will talk about the deep ambivalence and the fluctuations in authority and the tendencies to centralize and decentralize. So as well as the impact on competition among institutions. So I have given a lot of thought to that. I don't think I should break happily into my second lecture at this point. Yes, Barry.
Would you comment on the remark made by, I think, a distinguished sociologist about 60 years ago, and this concerns students. He said that the only reason that a modern society tolerates the enormous expense of the university is triage, that it desperately wants to know the top 10% of the cohort, of the young cohort, and all the talk about learning and scholarship and all that is really secondary to the need for triage on the cohort that's coming through.
Who said that?
Sir David somebody, I forgot.
Sir somebody, right? Well, I dare say that I don't see the whole that sharpness of contradiction that you summarize.
Well, I didn't mean it a contradiction, but you didn't mention students a great deal.
No, they're coming on later too. I haven't forgotten them. No, the whole. I'm going to review the real controversy as to that whole tension between the perpetuation of an elite and the feeding in of talent from below, and in particular, I'll discuss it in connection with the economic crisis of the university and its capacity to and the risk of going into a status affirming and status narrowing series of functions. So, yes, I'm very, very much aware of that. But on the other hand, I'll try to bring several considerations to bear on it rather than the simple dichotomy between perpetuation and exclusion. Yes?
I think one important fact about students is that they're a prime driver in the structural accretion through their request for non-academic services. And another prime driver in structural accretion would seem to me to be federal statute. For example, the research enterprise is beset now with many, many compliance functions. Can you think of other drivers of structural accretion?
Well, I mentioned and still would reemphasize the strength of the need for survival of institutions, particularly in the context of their own cultural growth, their growth of culture. That is to say, can you feature a college president or chancellor saying, we give up, we're just going to stay where we are and do what we do, we'll do a little better maybe, but to hell with this growth business. You do not hear those at your conferences, do you? I'm going to have a section in this on commercialization in the third lecture, in which I will talk about the student commercialization and the impact of it. Some of the effect you mentioned is there, and it spills over into significant sources of expenditure, such as housing, such as athletics, such as the vocationalism and the capacity or the willingness of institutions to expand randomly into areas that come into demand. Yes.
As the cost of going to college and graduate school and so on have increased, and I don't want to risk going into your third lecture, but
Well, that's a great ploy on my part, but yeah, I'll say something. Go ahead.
there is another group of students who have an opposite pull on universities. They might say to us, to hell with the beautiful campus, to hell with all the other services that you provide. What I need is a degree, and I'm willing to go to these new private digital higher education institutions, and those will certify me for my career and so on. And that seems to be the fastest growing sector
It is.
in higher education. So might that provide a market push toward perhaps greater economies, perhaps less proliferation of certain kinds of services, and so on the part of the traditional campus?
I've given a lot of thought to these nonprofits, and indeed will say something about it in the third. By and large, the effect which you enunciate is felt disproportionately at the community college and the four-year college, and to say nothing of other proprietary schools. That's where the real competition says. As one observer said, the University of Phoenix is not going to displace Harvard University. They're in a very, very different business. They have very few advanced degrees. They have a totally different commitment. They have part-time faculty entirely. It's a different breed, and it's a very serious institutional source of competition, and universities of high stature and prestige and standing have been influenced in what they're now toying around with respect to online choices. But I'm going to give an analysis of the choices that universities are making in this area, which are up to this point quite limited. There's Anne.
Yeah, I always think of an institution as being defined by its core purposes. So what we really mean by an institution has something to do with what we think its purposes are. And if you think that one of Clark Kerr's achievements was to define the research university as being about the creation of new knowledge as well as its sort of recuperation and transmission, is it your sense that structural accretion, how much range does the university have to drive the directions in which it accretes to protect its core purposes, versus how much does structural accretion mean that then everyone who's around the table, which now includes this incredible array of disparate stakeholders, would then redefine the purposes as whatever serves our collective interest? How do you see the...
Well, I would say the main effect is to multiply the purposes of the institution. I mean, the great trichotomy of service and teaching and research, of course, still is there. But by and large, it seems to me that the teaching has taken something of a back seat over the time. The crises in general education, it seems to me, cannot be divorced from the tendencies from both research development and the dominant incentives of faculty that have changed according with that research opportunities, as well as consultation being headed mainly under research. Those all have increased and are increasing much more. And of course, it's my own view that except for graduate training, the universities in particular have in fact set aside or reduced the commitment to teaching and have thereby given justification to the many Cassandra voices that complain about it. Yes.
Yes, I wondered whether or not, I mean, you're talking about patterns over time of the university, and today you laid out the context. I'm a bit surprised because you made allusion to the current crisis, the kind of gloom that.
If you saw my notes, it'd be in quotes.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think some of us would still have the thought that this is some kind of eventual radical transformation, at least in terms of the economic dimension, that is going to impact the wealth that's available to support many institutions, not just the university. And so that the larger societal structure, and especially the economic structure and the wealth that this country has had for many generations now, appears to me anyway to at least be more questionable than it has in the past. And to me, that at least presents the possibility of more radical change than we might have seen.
This is a fair summary of a great deal of thinking about higher education at the moment. I would add only two things to it, probably neither of which are totally satisfactory. In my reading of the historical literature, the complaint about the corrupting influence of money is absolutely continuous in talking about colleges and universities. It's not just Veblen's rantings about the whole thing. There's just this continuous reassertion of the corrupting influence. I tie that partly to this moral predisposition that I spoke of earlier, and I tie it to the fact that, in fact, it's always there in terms of the history of institutions. The second thing is that I absolutely agree with you that we're going in quite a number of new directions, and commercialization and globalization may summarize a lot of it. But we really have to be careful in analyzing precisely what that impact is going to be. It's not by definition a crisis, because we've been through very similar episodes over time, and in fact, still kind of gained a reputation worldwide of being the best, right? It's all a kind of strange commentary. So I would just have to kind of put the brakes on a little bit, and in fact, I will do my little bit to try to assess some of these changes in the last lecture. Yes. Sorry, Doris. Yes.
Well, given your diagnosis of the situation facing the university and the potential crisis, I would be interested if you have something to say, and especially on this occasion in honor of Clark Kerr, about the responsibility of leadership in this given situation.
Yes, my view is that the general response of leadership has not really been adequate to the situation. There is a great deal of internal differentiation and stratification and privilege among institutions. And the general tendency is for each segment, community college, state college, different status levels of colleges and universities, to kind of go their own way and survive. And some of them are more powerful in this regard than others because of their long tradition, because of their endowments, because of whatever you might say, their resources. And leadership will be exercised in these politics of survival. But I am not certain that's the most productive kind of leadership, is to look out for oneself. That certain collective responsibility, education as a whole is a fundamental feature of the society, though there are so many forces at work to fragment striving for survival that I'm a little pessimistic on that score. One more question? Yes. Oh, you have been out trying.
Would you like to comment on the effects of the international ranking metrics? Are they a force for homogenization, an instance of what Katerina Sorokin called quantophrenia, a force for good or ill?
International writing?
Ranking.
Ranking.
Ranking metrics.
Oh, I'm going to have
Shanghai Index, Times of London, what have you.
Oh, I'm going to have some hot words on that subject. basically mischievous. And I'll give you a lot of reasons why.
I'm going to have to pull down the curtain at this point because of the hour. I want to thank you, Neil, for a magnificent lecture. I want to encourage everyone to think of lectures 2 and 3, which are exactly 1 week from now and exactly 2 weeks from now in this very location, so it's easy to remember. Thank you, Neil.